Welcome everyone to the ISM-Rochester membership meeting. I'm Kathy Perna, your host for tonight's meeting. If you have a question, please put it in the chat and our speaker will answer your question. We are so excited to have Stephen Nichols, the founder of Banyan Business Outcomes LLC, as our speaker, who will talk about technology vendor management, getting the full value of the agreement and starting the path to partnership. Stephen helps clients improve vendor performance and develop true partnerships that create competitive advantages. And now I'd like to turn the stage over to Stephen.
Great, thank you, Kathy. Hopefully everyone can hear me, but I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you all and talk about how to get better value out of your technology vendor agreements. It's a topic that I'm passionate about and I'm forming this company around. So maybe I'll give just a little bit more background about where I'm coming from, and that should give some better context for it. But I think as Kathy might have mentioned, I spent most of my career working for technology services firms and creating relationships with between clients and those companies, so as an account manager. But I've left that life and decided to kind of pivot my career over the past 6 months, and I've been working on this idea around forming a company to consult on that idea. So I've spent the last 4 months interviewing about 70 different technology leaders around the country and asking them what the difference is between a poor performing vendor and a great vendor is, and what does a true partner look like. And I've been collecting all of that in a bunch of notebooks and thinking deeply about it, and then reading a bunch of books about procurement best practices and technology governance best practices. And what I'm trying to do is build this body of knowledge around managing technology vendors. So this presentation that we'll go through today is largely a readout of that research and the result of that research. So hopefully it's interesting, hopefully it's helpful. The idea is that at the end of the presentation, you'll be able to, have feel a little bit more empowered when you have conversations with your technology vendors, and make sure you're getting great value out of them. So it's intended to be educational, and hopefully it hits that mark. Now, I might mention this to you as well. Admittedly, technology governance and procurement governance, maybe a little bit of a dry topic at times. So I'll do my best to, make sure that it's interesting to listen to, but probably the best way to keep it engaging is if you all participate. So please do feel free to interrupt with questions, and I guess unmute if you can do that, or go through the chat if that's how you prefer. But if we end up having a conversation in the middle of it, that's absolutely fine. I think everyone would appreciate that too. So we'll go through a few different things. I guess the formal agenda, let me click on that slide. There we go. So that's me in my native habitat. I'm part fish apparently. But what we're gonna be going through is, first of all, problems with technology vendors, what that can look like. I'm gonna talk about how to improve vendor performance, both at the vendor level and when you're talking about a group of vendors or a portfolio of vendors together. I'll talk about vendor risks and vendor opportunities too. And then I'll talk about how to put all of this into practice in terms of doing audits of vendors and correcting performance and getting them healthy if that's possible. Or then also, putting together a vendor management office or something more formal to put some of these practices into place on a permanent, ongoing basis. So let's see, when I talk about technology vendors, I wanted to start with just kind of setting the table and what's the landscape for technology vendors. So this slide, I think, does a good job of that. I'll start at the bottom in the orange boxes. You have different types of vendors like hardware vendors or software vendors. You have connectivity vendors and co-location vendors. And then you also have cloud, right? Cloud is kind of eating up everything else. So a lot of the software companies are going with cloud options because that's what their valuations come off of. Above that, there's the green boxes, and these are the service providers. So you have like staff aug firms. These are companies that provide trade hours for dollars and will get a body for a rate into your office. You also have project services firms. Those are companies that pursue a specific deliverable, like an implementation, that kind of thing, or a rollout. And so that's another company you might interact with. There's managed services firms. Those are companies providing ongoing operational support. And then below that, there's VARs, or value-added resellers. Those are companies that resell the things from the orange boxes. and provide some kind of pre-sales engineering support typically, and that's what justifies the margin that goes to them. And then of course you have internal delivery too. So companies are going to have any kind of mix at all of these different boxes. Some companies really prefer internal delivery and they're a DIY shop. Some companies heavily outsource absolutely everything they possibly can, and that's a heavily managed services kind of shop. And they may use more hardware, more cloud, more software. It can be kind of different for each type of company. You bet. I see an email question. We'll get that out to you. Thank you. Let's see. So in terms of delivery model example, so this is a example of a client that I've actually worked with that I spent a couple of years supporting at a previous company. Just like from a very high level, on the bottom of that OEM layer, there were third-party applications that we were supporting. This is for a desktop that a bunch of developers were using. There's Microsoft Office that they had. There was Citrix that was providing the desktop. There was network technology like Cisco. There's security like Palo Alto that's taking care of it. And then there's Azure, which is the cloud infrastructure layer underneath it, right? And those are all the OEM companies. In the green boxes, this is where it really got interesting. There were help desk managed services vendors. There was a desktop managed services vendor, a Citrix managed services, cloud managed services, network managed services, and security managed services. Everyone was covering some different base. There were a lot of bases on this baseball field. And then we all reported up through the blue boxes, through a user experience VP, through a cloud architect, and then IT leadership like a CTO. Well, it was a CTO that we worked with too. So when you look at all these different boxes, I think the thing that should jump out at you, and probably does jump out at you, is there's a lot of opportunity for this kind of thing, right? For finger pointing, for people dodging accountability, or just general confusion, just honest general confusion about who's responsible for doing what. And that was one of the many challenges that we faced with this client. And that I think a lot of companies face when they're talking about a complex portfolio of vendors. So these are the common problems with external delivery. I'm going to start on the right-hand side of the screen. So you have the guy with the 1980s haircut talking about issues with operational enterprise architecture. This is a fancy way of saying, things like vendor overlap or vendor gaps, where the RACI or the outline of what people are supposed to be covering might not quite cover everything that needs to be covered, or there might be some redundancy that creates more confusion and doesn't really solve any kinds of problems. And then below that, there's vendor-to-vendor conflict, very common. Excuse me, very common in the industry too. All of those different managed services partners compete with one another. All of them are trying to do a land and expand approach to the business, where they get a small piece of business and then they go wide and eventually take over the entire world. And what that does is create a lot of potential for conflict and for issues where it's not in your best interest to back up somebody else. It's in your best interest to kind of throw them under the bus every once in a while, maybe tactfully. And there's all kinds of vendor issues when you have a complex portfolio like that. On the vendor specific side, of course, is just simple vendor non-performance. Vendors just simply don't fulfill the terms of the agreement. Vendor risk is a big issue too. Cybersecurity risk or operational risk are the two big ones that I face. So, a vendor might accidentally open up some kind of vulnerability in your network that allows in an attack of some sort. And then vendor lock-in, I think, is also a vendor-specific risk that needs to be addressed. Vendor lock-in is when it's just impossible to get rid of the vendor because of a technology decision, because of intellectual property, political thing. It could be a number of reasons, but anything that upsets the balance of power between the vendor and the client is probably a good example of vendor lock-in. Let's see, so those are issues with the specific vendors, but there's another issue too with vendors, and that is that sometimes what they're doing can become disconnected from what the business actually needs. So this is a lot to look at, but in theory, there's the stakeholder needs at the very top of the chart or the flow, and then you have business strategies and business operations, and then technology strategy and operations are a component of that. And below that, you have external delivery, internal and external delivery, right? And then vendor performance is a component of that. So the question is, like, if you were to improve a vendor's performance down here at this layer, would it really be felt all the way up at the stakeholder needs or at the business strategy level? or more often, I think, is the vendor actually performing things that deliver value all the way up to that chain to the business. And sometimes that becomes disconnected over time, right? Because 3 years ago, this vendor made a whole lot of sense and no longer does it make any sense at all. Or 3 years ago, this complex matrix of managed services partners was the best way to do it. But now because of technology changes or whatever, it's no longer the relevant way to handle it. So that's another, it's another process that every technology department has to do on a regular basis. It's just a rationalization of the vendors in making sure they're continuing to deliver great business value for the company. Let's see. So that's, I guess that's some vendor landscape and kind of setting the table for the rest of the presentation. A lot of the research I did over the past 4 months began with questions about what does great vendor performance look like? And I kind of developed these 4 different categories. So I'll start at the bottom. If I'm talking about vendor performance, I'm first thinking about my at-risk vendors. These are vendors who are not fulfilling the terms of their agreement. I simply just don't trust them to do what they say or what they say they did. Hopefully there's just a few vendors, but I think everyone can probably think of a few they're dealing with right now. Above that, you have a performing vendor. This category probably makes up the vast majority of your technology vendors. Software companies in particular, you buy the product does what it's supposed to do, you don't worry about it. And that's fine. Like, I don't actually need strategic alignment with every single vendor that I'm working with. If it's Adobe Acrobat, like, we don't have to have a vision statement for Adobe Acrobat. We just need the reader is all it is. Above that, there's a preferred vendor. Preferred vendors usually go above and beyond. They probably are delivering things that are a little closer to business value. And maybe they're taking care of a key system or something that's pretty essential for the business. But they aren't quite a true partner. A true partner, by my definition at least, is a relationship based on reciprocity. It's based on co-investment and co-benefit. It's a company where I'm committed to their success and they're committed to my success as well. And we're able to kind of grow our businesses together. I think challenge is another great word here too. When I've had partnerships in the past, or when I consider myself a true partner, I've been able to say very challenging things to my clients to inspire them to do better, or call them out on things, that kind of stuff. And they absolutely have felt like they could do it for me. And I think all of us get better, especially with some candid advice at times. So I think true partnerships are rare. I think they also deliver exponential and unbounded value at times. So if I work with a true partner and they help me develop an interesting new product that revolutionizes the industry, well, that's probably worth to me many times, many hundreds of times perhaps, what the cost of those services were. So I'm getting unbounded value from doing that work. I guess I should explain too, this blue line here, the idea here is symbolically showing the value you get from each level of partner, right? Or each level of performance from a partner. So preferred vendors obviously deliver better value than performing vendors. Performing vendors are fine. They like I say, that's probably the vast majority of the vendors that you have. And then at-risk vendors are poorly performing. They're probably delivering less value. You might say the value they deliver is less than the cost of keeping them on board. It might be just cheaper to do it yourself than to work with an at-risk vendor. And unfortunately, at-risk vendors can provide or can create for you asymmetrical and unbounded negative value, right, through the form of risk. For an example, if you have a poorly performing HRIS vendor that's working over here in HR, and they create a network vulnerability over here, completely unrelated to what they're doing, and that allows a hacker to get in, and some ransomware thing goes up, and it spins up, then you can end up losing many times more than the cost of the engagement with the HRIS company. But that's why it's unbounded. That's why it's asymmetrical too in terms of risk. But more often than not, an at-risk vendor, the risk that you're really facing is just the fees you paid the vendor so far. If the project or whatever that they're doing for you fails, like you just might just lose that money. Okay, so this is missing a dimension, right? Because not every vendor is doing the same kind of thing. Some vendors are doing more relevant or more useful work than others. the person who comes in and waters the plants, they may be performing really, really well, but they're not going to be a true partner, right? Just based on they're not doing anything really critical for the business. So I think that's another thing to bring into this. I'm looking at importance. So to go through this, on the x-axis of the chart over there on the right, I have transactional, important, and strategic vendors. And this is based on the importance of what they're delivering or the relevancy of what they're delivering. I have a great book, and if you're looking for a book, I would recommend this one. Yeah, I'll send a link out to it, but it's Supplier Relationship Management by O'Brien. Yes, Jonathan O'Brien. So he defines the relevancy of the vendor by those 5 terms on the left there. Risk, how could the vendor hurt us? Difficulty in terms of switching the vendor out, the current importance to the business versus the future importance to the business, and then alignment. Are we organizationally aligned? Probably not just like ethically, but also organizationally aligned. Like, do they have offices where we have offices, that kind of thing. So if you score all of the points or all of the categories on the left, then you can figure out where a vendor fits on the x-axis on the right. And then, is their performance at risk, performing, or preferred, and end up putting a dot somewhere, right? Somewhere on that matrix wherever it fits. If it's below the line, then probably some kind of intervention makes some sense, right? Because if it's a strategic kind of vendor, you would expect preferred or partner level performance, versus if it's a transactional vendor, at risk or performing might be fine, depending on what they're doing. So just some thoughts about how to do. Okay, so that's how we think about vendors, or how I think about vendors at least. I guess the next area here is how do we improve a vendor's performance? So I want to start off with the definition of quality. I think there's 3 different lenses that you need when you're considering the quality of a vendor. I'll start at the bottom here. The first area is the contract terms. So your contract is probably going to have quantitative terms around SLAs and KPIs, dates and deliverables, that kind of thing. Contract terms are also static, right? You write them, and then 2 years later, you're still living up to them. So they can get kind of aged at times. And typically, you only look at a contract when there's some kind of dispute that needs to be resolved. So contracts can become, dusty old documents that sit on a P drive somewhere and nobody ever looks at. That is more often than not what happens. So vendors might fail or might succeed based on their fulfillment of contract terms. The second level up there is the business needs. So business needs are typically technology agnostic. They're typically based on experience or some kind of business outcome that you're going after, and they frequently change, right? New leadership comes in, something happens in the market, whatever it is, and what the business is looking for out of the technology is totally different than what it was looking for before. So vendors can be completely, doing really well, fulfilling the terms of the contract, but fail to actually deliver any business value because of some kind of misalignment or drift between what they should have been performing and what they are performing. And then one layer up from that is the industry, right? So a company might be fulfilling the terms of the contract, might be taking care of the business, but technology changes constantly. And, a year and a half, 2-3 years, like that's a long time in the world of tech. And you can end up with some innovations that make the service itself that they're delivering completely irrelevant. So it's typically technology driven. They can be general and unapplied to the business. And the best way to measure these is thinking about next best alternatives, right? If this vendor were to close up shop tomorrow and we had to scramble to find something else, what would that alternative look like? And is that alternative actually better than what we currently have, right? So if I'm thinking about a vendor and if they're delivering great quality, I'm thinking about these 3 lenses. And then if I'm putting that into some kind of engagement or some kind of process to get them healthy, then what I'm doing first of all in that first step is defining quality in terms of industry, business, and contract. Defining their actual delivery in those 3 different areas, and then figuring out the gap, right? So are they delivering the best possible service compared to the industry? Are they delivering the best experience, based on what my clients or what my internal clients, what my business needs? And are they delivering against the SLAs and KPIs and deliverables that they're contracted to in the agreement? So once I understand that, then I can kind of get a sense of the size of the problem that I might have with a vendor. And the next step to fixing that is gathering commitment. So, and that happens on both sides. You have to figure out the business case for making the improvement internally, making sure that, if you improve the vendor's performance by 50% or whatever the number is, then, will the business actually, see the benefit from that? And is it worth the effort to do so, or should we be focused elsewhere? I think you also need to make sure you have the commitment from the vendor and not just assume that you have that, right? Because some vendors may consider your business transactional, or they may not see it as a priority or that kind of thing. So you can spend a whole lot of time waving your arms and getting frustrated with the vendor, and then they're simply not willing to respond or not willing to help. But once you have commitment from both sides, or if you do get commitment from both sides, then you move on to the next set, which is setting roles, objectives, key results. What are we after? What does good look like? And can we come to terms with a plan for making that happen? So I'm also in favor of a continuous improvement cycle whenever you make changes to processes or to vendor performance or things like this. What doesn't work in my experience is, having one of these meetings with the vendor where you bring out the contract and say, you're supposed to be doing X, and instead you're doing Y, and you got to fix it by tomorrow, or I'm going to yell at you some more. This doesn't seem to work very often. What does work a lot better is saying, there's obviously a gap here, guys. Let's come up with a plan, and we're going to work on it together, and it's going to be 30, 60, 90 days. These are the objectives to get to a healthy state. And continuous improvement, like a Kaizen or a lean approach to it, Six Sigma, that kind of thing. That really is very effective, I guess, in showing your partnership with the vendor, or showing your willingness to help the vendor get on the right side of the law and deliver good business. Now, the other alternative to it is you might get to the end of the process over here, where you've understood the gap and just decided that this vendor isn't worth saving, or the contract only has a few more months left in the term. So we should rather be thinking about the next RFI, the next RFP, or competitive selection process to find the next vendor, as opposed to saving this one, in which case just take a left instead of a right and write out the agreement, and then just make sure you're on it for that automatic renewal date. So in terms of a portfolio, I think this is a process that companies really need to go through on a regular basis, because vendor sprawl is just such a common problem, especially with the rise of consumer-based IT, or what we also call shadow IT, where people who are non-technical can sign up for any kind of service. So a vendor portfolio analysis is really helpful because it shows all the overlap and the gaps between your vendors. It reduces your vendor-to-vendor conflict. It lowers the carrying costs for the vendors. Let me lean into that a little bit. So vendor carrying costs is all of the soft costs and sometimes hard costs involved in supporting the vendor in terms of managing the invoicing, keeping them up to date on business news, doing all the rework and the supervision and all of the management time that goes into a vendor. And when you have too many vendors, you can end up spending your entire day just managing the vendor rodeo, as opposed to actually creating value for the business. So consolidating vendors also lowers vendor carrying costs. Okay. Next thing you can do is lower risk. Too many vendors means too much risk. It creates better business value. And then also resiliency and flexibility is going to be key. If you get too big a giant set of vendors, then you have some limited options there. So the approach for a vendor analysis, or vendor portfolio analysis rather, is pretty similar. Before you get engaged, you really need to survey the vendors and understand everyone who's who at the zoo and what they're doing and who's responsible for it. So I have find the owner listed on it. It's really important to have someone's name next to every single vendor that you have, someone who's responsible for that relationship and responsible for making sure the company is getting value out of that relationship. If you have an orphaned vendor, or a vendor that doesn't have an owner, and that happens, chances are you're not getting anything close to the value that you need. Orphaned vendors are, I think, a big problem. That's where, Bob in accounting signed up for a service 4 years ago, and it was a great service, but Bob left 2 years ago, but you can't terminate the agreement because all of our data is in the system and no one's had time to migrate it out. Or even worse, no one knows what it is and everyone's afraid to turn it off because you could, break something pretty critical. So, yeah, finding an owner, categorizing it, seeing where these vendors fit, and then making some decisions about where to get started on the whole portfolio of vendors to kind of rationalize that. So your first priority are always going to be emergencies, vendors who are creating undue risk for the business, vendors who just simply aren't performing at all and need to be pushed out, things like that. Orphan vendors should also be a priority because it's usually low-hanging fruit. And then getting control of contract renewals. Most technology agreements have terms like you need to notify us between 90 days and 180 days before the end of the agreement if you're not going to renew the agreement. And that's done intentionally to make it a little difficult to provide that kind of notice. So having a calendar, that tells you when those dates are coming up and tells you with enough notice, you can actually run an RFI and an RFP and find the right vendor before that date pops up. That's pretty important. So as a part of serving vendors, making a big list of all of the different dates that are involved in it, that's going to save you a lot of headaches down the road and hopefully some money too. And then after you've done all of that, you get into the second priority, which are going to be looking at all the different vendors, maybe go area by area, all the telecom first, all the software second, or all the HR vendors. It depends on your business and your business's needs and objectives. One point here for the second priority is you might start with your better performing vendors and work your way down to your at-risk vendors. And the reason is if you rationalized all your preferred vendors first, then you're going to be that much stronger when you have conversations with your performing vendors. And if you understand how the performing vendors are working, then you get to the at-risk vendors, your negotiating position is going to be rock solid, right? Because why do I even need you guys? I got all these vendors I just talked to, and they're doing great work for us. And that's a position of power that you want to have if you're working your way down. And then finally, the output of it is decisions around which vendors to terminate, which vendors to consolidate, rebid, renegotiate, onboard into the vendor management office, et cetera. So I want to push back here a little bit on my own slides. And this is something I was thinking about earlier today. I've probably talked to 24 procurement professionals over the past 4 months. And almost without exception, what I've heard is this sounds great. We love to manage contracts for vendors after they've hired, and we'd love to do these kind of value mining exercises to find places to save money. But we all have RFPs due, and we're all really busy with that, and we're not really staffed up to do this kind of rationalization work. And I don't know if that's how you all feel about that, or maybe you don't, but I get that quite a bit. I guess if you find yourself in that boat, I think that there's a couple things you can do when you're first initiating the agreement that might save you some trouble down the road, a year, 2, 3 years down the road when you're trying to manage it. And that is starting contracts with good governance in place. So when you're in a sales process with a vendor, making sure the commitments that they're making to you are governable, right? They're measurable commitments. I can test whether or not the vendor actually performed this, right? When you're writing the contract, similarly, spend the extra hour going through the contract and making sure that you have great terms and that all of them there are objective, measurable terms in the agreement. And then I think everyone tries to do that. But then the next step, I think, is maybe where the miss happens is during transition. What I would recommend doing, and what I've done in the past, is you take the contract and you pull out all the obligations from the vendor is making and put it into a vendor scorecard. And those are the rows. And then in the columns, maybe symbolically or maybe literally, in the columns, you have each quarter. It's year 1, quarter 1, year 2, quarter, or year 1, quarter 1, quarter 2, quarter 3, quarter 4, like that. And then on a quarterly basis, especially if it's a key vendor, just check these off. Like, did the vendor live up to the terms of the agreement for all of these quarters? And what that does for you during the quarterly business review is it first of all, like shows the vendor that you're paying attention, that you're minding the shop. And also it creates a record for the vendor's performance over the past year, or over the term of the agreement so far. And that's going to help you realize which vendors are really performing well from an objective perspective and which vendors aren't performing so well. I think this is also part of a greater vendor management office effort kind of thing. And that is, if you're able to figure out which vendors really perform well and you formalize that preferred vendor status, then ask your IT department or ask whoever's making decisions on this to go first through the preferred vendors before going to the performing vendors. And at-risk vendors, they don't talk about nothing until they get their level of performance up to a medium or to a good level where we can be satisfied with what they're currently doing. And I think that kind of policy, if you're able to actually put that in place, reduces a lot of the noise. I think it gets the vendors focused on what's actually important. And I think it also minimizes all that vendor-to-vendor conflict, because the network vendor is no longer trying to poach business from the security vendor, because the network vendor has to get his own house in order before he worries about anything else outside of his world. So maybe those are some ideas, and maybe you guys have some other ideas too, but I don't know, some of those things. Let's see, so the next area here is vendor risk and partnership. So I'm thinking about, that graph I showed that had the wavy line, the cubic parabola. So I'm thinking about the two extremes, like vendors that perform very poorly, what does risk look like? And vendors that perform really well and become partners, what does that look like? So under vendor risk, I'll use, I think, a well-known example, and that's Target. So Target, unfortunately, I think it was 2006, had a hack, I think, that everyone probably knows about, where all the credit card numbers were stolen. So the origin of that, what actually happened was an HVAC company that was responsible for managing the temperatures in all of the refrigerators where they keep the milk. They had a piece of software that sat on the network and monitored those refrigerators and then reported back, and that was a way of being able to kind of anticipate when when they needed to send a service person out. Well, somebody at that HVAC company or that refrigeration company got an email that came in, and it was a spam kind of thing, a hack kind of thing, and they got into that vendor's network. And from there, they injected software into the vendor's software. The vendor then unwittingly injected that software into Target's network, and then Target had to deal with this because they could move laterally through the network and find point of sale and where all the credit card data was. So this is, asymmetrical, right? When I talk about out of left field, the kind of risk that you can have. Poor vendor performance in this case created operational risk for the target. It created a security risk, quite obviously. It created legal and compliance risk. I think they paid about $450 million in fines over it. And then obviously some reputation and brand, because people like me are still picking on the company 15 years later. So technology risk or technology vendor risk is real, and it's really substantial, not just cybersecurity, but also operational risk. And having some kind of plan in place, working with the CISO to put that together makes a ton of sense, and should be done for every single vendor, regardless of what they're working on, not just the network vendor or the security vendor. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, you have true partnerships. So like I was saying, for me, a true partner is something a little bit different from a preferred vendor. It's not just a vendor who wantonly exceeds the terms of the agreement without asking for any kind of extra fees or that kind of thing. It's a vendor where there's this co-investment. So I feel like they're an extension of my team. We co-invest in innovation to our mutual benefit. We're growing together, and they're challenging me, and our businesses are more successful because we're working with each other. Right? So I think the hallmark of a true partner, the difference between the two levels, is this partner-led innovation level. So preferred vendor on the bottom, partner-led innovations between it. and that creates a true partnership. So again, in this SRM book, great book, I'll give another plug for that. I don't know him, Jonathan O'Brien, by the way, but I can get a beer with him. Anyway, so there's 4 different types of partner-led innovation. There's new to market innovation. That's when a vendor comes up with a new idea, it's a new product, and he's offering to all of his new clients, and he comes over and offers it to you. There's uncoordinated innovation. That's when a vendor thinks up something kind of crazy or some new innovation, I guess, and takes the guy out to lunch and says, hey, let me run this idea past you and see if there's something you might want. The problem with uncoordinated innovation is that it's often off the mark. It misses the mark. They're working on an area where you already have something working, or their suggestion is nice but doesn't take into account all the complexities. There's exclusively coordinated partner-led innovation, and this is really where you get into the partnership level. Exclusively coordinated is when I task a specific vendor to solve a specific problem for me, right? And they're solving the problem just for me, not for anybody else, although there might be some agreement where they can reuse the intellectual property or that kind of thing. But partners or vendors have this great perspective where they understand enough of your business, hopefully, to be able to come up with great suggestions. But they also get exposed to quite a number of other businesses, so they can see what everyone else is doing in the area. And they also have just an outsider's mindset. So sometimes those exclusively coordinated innovations can be right on target and can be kind of game changers too. And then finally, there's collaborative innovation. And that's kind of exciting. That's when a client and a vendor say, let's get 2 of our smartest guys in a room together for a week, and they can work on solving this problem. And maybe you guys end up with a product you can sell to the clients, and maybe we get to solve the problem on our side, and everyone walks away happy. So collaborative innovation, I think, is the most powerful, but it also requires a great deal of trust between the vendor and the client. And I think that also is, if you're able to do collaborative innovation and do that successfully, then I think the vendor has just become a partner and should be recognized as such. Let's see. So we talked about what vendors are in the market. We talked about how do we judge performance of a vendor. We also talked about risk and opportunity with vendors. And I think the last area to go through here is a vendor management office, or really just how do you operationalize all of this? Because as I said, I think it's very common for a procurement group to be very busy with RFPs and not have time to actually manage agreements when they're out in the field and working. So a vendor management office is kind of a hybrid between several different functions. It's a cross-functional group that it's a little bit finance, a little bit procurement, it's a little bit technology, and a little bit security. It's really relevant for business process outsourcing or complex agreements. I know of a large hospital chain here in Colorado that outsourced all of their IT and had to form a VMO just wrapped around that business process outsourcing agreement. And that made a whole lot of sense for them. They're typically focused on the forest, on managing all the vendors that are out there, but then especially the sequoias, or the big ones, right, that are most relevant. They typically work in line with the technology function, so they're going to report up through a CIO, although not always. You can do it either way. And then not just strategic sourcing, right? They're also involved in the ongoing management of the vendor too. Another best practice is, you got from another book, is you may consider firewalling off any kind of transactional procurement from the VMO, because it's really easy to get your day overwhelmed by doing, buying mice and switches and transactional kinds of things, as opposed to working on the more strategic objectives that you might have. So a VMO does strategic sourcing, of course. It does contract lifecycle management. It might do financial management. Is the invoice correct? Should we be billing back to the department? And how much do we bill back to the department? Vendor performance management, which I think is a big gap. There's a lot of need there. Risk mitigation, managing disputes, and then that vendor catalog. So this is the idea of getting a list of all the vendors who are currently in the environment, and coming up with some kind of catalog where you can say these vendors are performing very well, and we have an internal reference in Joe down the hallway from you. And if you have another a requirement that's in their core competencies, we'd recommend working off that vendor catalog first, and that'll save you a whole lot of trouble as procurement professionals. So that's a technology VMO, and that kind of covers the bulk of the slides and the content I wanted to get through. I really appreciate the chance to talk to you all, and would love to field any questions you might have. And maybe at the end, if you guys are interested, I can talk a little bit about some of the things I'm trying to accomplish with Banyan Business Outcomes and some of the goals that I have in the short term. So with that, let me open it up for questions, and let me know if anyone has anything to talk about.
Well, one question. Do you have any thoughts on how procurement can partner with the IT?
Yeah, you bet. So I think I've been reading a lot of procurement books, right, and understanding some of the best practices that you all are pretty familiar with. And I honestly wish I would have read these a long time ago, because I've been working on the technology side for the bulk of my career, right? So I think that procurement provides a lot of value around negotiating great contracts and governable agreements in particular. And I think that a lot of IT people and maybe a lot of procurement people assume that the technology professionals might have more experience finding great vendors and getting them in place and contracting there than they actually do. So I think that you guys have a lot of expertise that's highly relevant, especially if you're doing more than just contracting, but also managing the vendor's performance ongoing. Hopefully that makes sense.
Thank you. I see Leanna has her hand up. I'm going to actually let you speak, Leanna. Go ahead, Leanna.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Stephen, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us tonight. We really appreciate it. And, vendor maintenance, vendor management, all of that is kind of a tough topic. So I think it's a great one to talk about. I just want to let you know one of my key takeaways was about the scorecard, and that being a great way to manage the contracts throughout instead of just waiting to the end and scrambling when the contract's over, making sure the vendor is performing throughout the time period. So I just want to say thank you again for joining us tonight, and your insights were amazing. So thank you.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate that. I developed vendor scorecards for quite a number of vendors, and for myself when I was a vendor, right? Just to be able to track performance and prove that I'm delivering good value. And it's funny, I think, how everyone kind of is like there's all this work that goes into writing the contract and negotiating the terms, and there's all this back and forth that happens. And then more often than not, the contract just gets filed away, and it's more of a political kind of conversation and debate. Well, this is what I think you should do. And the agreement never gets pulled out, or only rarely, and only in extreme conflict gets pulled out. So I think abstracting that into some kind of measurable scorecard and a governance framework, I think is really important. So I appreciate you picked up on that.
Another question: how do you negotiate with a vendor who is locked in?
Yeah, I think the trick here is getting options, right? Usually lock-in is about not having any options. So going out and finding other vendors that provide similar services and understanding what the business, what's out there in the industry makes you feel much more empowered when you go back and talk to the vendor themselves. Technology is constantly changing, obviously. So sometimes what was vendor lock-in 3-4 years ago is now pretty easy to move away from. So a good example of that is everyone moved into the cloud, and a lot of companies were paying maybe too much for their Azure or for their AWS or the public cloud spend. But there's something called Docker and container technology that allows for very easy or relatively easy movement from cloud provider to cloud provider. And if you're able to move into that prevents the vendor lock-in and gives you a lot more options.
Okay. Last question I have here is: how do you coordinate between multiple managed service partners?
You bet. So like I was saying before, you can have, if you have too many managed services partners and there isn't a clear RACI. RACI is a type of chart. It's responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. And the idea is you list out all the different stakeholders and you give them one of those letters, RACI, and that kind of chart, I guess, it describes who's responsible for doing what, right? And who's accountable, and so on, et cetera. So having that built out and then recognizing complexity that's inherent in it, and having honest conversations with all the vendors about the complexity and trying to minimize it, like that's going to be like a key exercise you really have to do, especially when anything changes in the environment. There's also something that's done commonly in energy, which is called a joint operating agreement. Well, there's a joint operating procedure and a joint operating agreement, JOP and a JOA. So it's essentially a document that all the vendors would sign in, where it outlines, what each vendor is working on, what communication method they're going to use, how they're going to talk to each other, the risks that are inherent in the relationship, how you're going to resolve conflict when that comes up, and it just treats the entire enterprise, including all the vendors and the client, as one, big value chain or one big entity. And the JOA is the formal document that makes sense of all of that and provides some kind of architecture behind it.
What was the name of that book you referenced in the middle of the program?
Yeah, it's Supplier Relationship Management by Jonathan O'Brien.
Okay, thank you. Just in case anybody needed that. I just wanted to make sure. And so what's going on with your company?
Yeah, well, let's see. So I'm excited about it, honestly. Like, I think it's going pretty well. I think I'm heading in the right direction. So like I said before, I help companies grow the business value they get from their spend with technology vendors. And I'm developing quite a number of services, but they're all based around these three pillars. I think services companies tend to underperform. I think products tend to be overconsumed. And I'm thinking of connectivity, I'm thinking of software, cloud licensing, all kinds of stuff. And then I'm thinking that technology spend tends to decouple from business value. And I have developed approaches to resolving all of those issues and making sure that you're getting great value out of the vendors. The area I'm focused on for right now is around technology services vendor gaps. So I think a lot of services companies have inconsistent delivery. Maybe there's excessive rework or noise in that relationship, or there's some kind of disconnect from business value. And I've developed kind of a rapid approach for looking at a specific vendor and optimizing it to create better visibility, better value, and create a better, stronger negotiating position if you're working with the vendor, to have them either get healthy or to replace the vendor if that's what's necessary too. So it's this is a short engagement. It's about 10 hours of work for me to come back with a plan to get them healthy, and a vendor scorecard and some governance framework to help you guys be more effective. And the goal is to get 3 of those put together here in April. I have 1 more slot in March I'm looking to fill 2. But I'm going to be doing a number of these for free, just to kind of formalize the process and develop some references. And would love to have an opportunity to work with any of you if you have a vendor, a services vendor in particular, who is underperforming and could use a little encouragement. So that's one idea. But of course, I'd be happy to talk about all of it.
Well, thank you. Let me see. There's something in the Q&A box. More of a comment, but after working in procurement for 2 IT resellers for over 25 years and changing gears, working for a nonprofit, for not-for-profit, standardization across as many IT platforms as possible saves so much time and less vendors to deal with. Having that understanding helps the IT procurement relationship. Yeah, totally, absolutely. Because there's this consumerization of IT, one way they refer to it, but anyone can sign up for a new app or a new service, and it's really easy to do. And that's honestly the business model these SaaS companies are using. The problem with it is that people solve their specific problem in their specific department over here, and maybe don't consider all the interoperability requirements where everyone else can benefit from 10% of what you do over there, or 20% of that.
So particularly when you're trying to pass information from department to department or from system to system, it gets really complex really quickly. So being able to control that and have, corporate systems, I think that's really solves a lot of interoperability problems. But I think also you have to have a flexible approach that allows people to use these best of breed systems when appropriate. Just make sure they're using it with a way that adheres to data, data governance policies and all security requirements that you have. But I agree. Yeah, I like that.
Thank you. That was from Lonnie. Thanks, Lonnie.
Oh.
Okay, any closing thoughts before we close out the evening?
Well, like I said, I really appreciate the chance to talk to you all. Please check out BanyanOutcomes.com is the website. I have a YouTube channel and do videos almost on a daily basis. And also I'm really active on LinkedIn, so check me out there too. And look forward to hearing from you all.
Yeah, he definitely is active on LinkedIn, I'll tell you that. Okay, thank you so much, Stephen, for such an informative program. I thought it was terrific. And to all of our attendees that were able to join us tonight. As I said earlier, I'll be emailing out the recording link and also the CEU for your attendance. I'll take care of that probably tomorrow. Just want to do one program note. Next week, March 23rd, we will be bringing you Tom Cook, who will talk about managing successful negotiations with vendors and suppliers. So the vendor theme is for March. So we hope you can join us next week as well. At this point, I'm going to close out the program. I'm going to say good night to everybody and thank you for joining us.
You all.
Thank you.